Imagine a tank that could travel further, faster, and more reliably than anything else. But with its ability came an extreme danger, so deadly it was never supposed to be seen by anyone outside of its lab. What if I told you that not only did this tank exist, but there were plans to produce thousands of them? This is the story of Project Red Storm, the insane plan to build a nuclear-powered tank. The history of nuclear power began in the late 1940s when scientists first developed the atomic weapon. Suddenly, humanity had the most destructive force the world had ever seen. Within a few years, America and the Soviet Union would engage in a deadly race to see who could do everything first: land a man on the moon, send a satellite into orbit, create a super powerful computer. And among those things was figuring out how to harness the atom for peaceful purposes, one of which would be powering vehicles. Russia's best scientists and engineers met in a secret laboratory in the mountains of Siberia, where they designed a new type of engine unlike anything the world had ever seen. It would use a miniaturized nuclear core to produce power continuously. There would be no moving parts, no explosions or emissions, and the fuel would last for hundreds of years. In theory, this technology could power vehicles at speeds and distances never before imaginable. But there was a problem, a big one. Nuclear power requires heat to produce electricity, and in order to maintain that heat, the reactor must be kept at a steady temperature. If the temperature became too high, the reactor would melt down, and if it got too low, the chain reaction would stop working entirely. This made building a nuclear engine incredibly difficult. To all, how do you keep a nuclear reactor at exactly the right temperature? To solve this problem, the Soviets would design a unique cooling system using liquid metal, specifically lithium, which has a very high thermal conductivity. They would circulate the lithium around the reactor to absorb the excess heat. The lithium would then pass through radiators to cool off before being pumped back into the reactor to repeat the process. In 1956, after years of research and development, the engine was finally completed. Now it was time to put it to the test. There was just one issue. They had created something so powerful that their test track literally melted through the concrete floor of the testing facility. Whatever they had built was producing far too much power for its size. To assessing the damage and fixing the roof, they tried again. But as soon as the prototype moved under its own power, the ground beneath it started to buckle. It was clear that whatever they had built was emitting an incredible amount of radiation. Now, the Soviets had two options. The first was to scrap the project and focus on something else. But there was so much potential with this new technology that they decided to push forward. So instead of trying to control the power of the reactor, why not control the vehicle itself? Thus began the development of the world's first nuclear-powered tank, the Object 279. It was an incredibly ambitious project, but also one of the most secretive. Very little is known about the details of the tank, but we do know it was heavily armed with cannons and rockets, and that it had a crew of 3. Why does it have a crew of 3? Well, let me explain. The engine produced so much power, it required 3 people just to operate it. The driver controlled the speed and direction of the vehicle, while the other 2 operators monitored the reactor. You see, running a nuclear reactor isn't easy. It's an incredibly delicate balancing act. You have to keep the temperature stable and be constantly on guard for emergencies. But even with all that, it still broke down all the time. The engine would overheat and the radiator would leak. It was so unreliable, in fact, that the entire crew had to wear protective gear in case of a meltdown. Despite these setbacks, the tests continued. With each new test, the tank got closer to being deployed in the field. By 1962, the Soviets had built 6 prototypes and were ready for mass production. Plans were underway to build over 1,000 of these vehicles, and it's unclear whether any other countries tried to follow suit. But the engine was such a disaster waiting to happen that the Soviet military began calling it a traveling Chernobyl. first sign of trouble was the strange patterns left in the snow. First, the military thought it was sabotage, but when they investigated further, they discovered the truth. The nuclear reactor was leaking and poisoning the soil. This wasn't good, but even worse was the effect it was having on the crew. Many of them began to suffer from radiation sickness, leading to hair loss, vomiting, and burns. Some of them didn't survive. Okay, at this point, the project should have been canceled immediately. Okay, but the Soviets were already planning to deploy the tank in Vietnam. In the early 1960s, the United States and Soviet Union realized that the war in Vietnam could be the first real battle between the two superpowers. It was an opportunity to show the world which side was stronger, and they weren't going to let it go to waste. The US had already begun sending military aid to South Vietnam, and the Soviets wanted to do the same for the North. What better way to show your ally that you're really serious than by sending them the most advanced weapon in the world? But as soon as the Object 279 arrived in Vietnam, the problems began. First, the locals refused to accept the tank because it was spewing radiation everywhere. Then it got stuck in the mud. The thing is, nuclear reactors don't handle rough terrain very well. When the vehicle moves, the gyroscopes become unbalanced, causing the reactor to destabilize. As a result, the engine had to be turned off whenever the tank went off-road. And at this point, the Soviet leadership had a choice to make: continue with the charade or cut their losses and pull the plug. They chose the latter. In 1965, the program was officially canceled and the remaining vehicles were scrapped. But that didn't mean the end for nuclear-powered tanks. In fact, the idea stayed in development until the 1980s. Throughout the Cold War, the US and Soviet Union competed in an arms race that knew no bounds. Each new invention resulted in an even bigger, more devastating weapon, and nuclear power was no exception. In the 1960s, the US began developing its own nuclear-powered tank engine called the AGN-150. Like the Russian engine, it used a molten salt reactor to produce power. But unlike the Russian design, it was much smaller. The American engine weighed only 500 pounds, whereas the Russian engine weighed several tons. Okay? But what good was a small reactor if it couldn't power a tank? To solve this problem, the Americans came up with a clever solution. They attached 4 engines to one vehicle, creating the world's first nuclear-powered tracked vehicle. It looked like a cross between a tank and a motorcycle, and it could travel at speeds up to 60 miles per hour. The crew operated the vehicle using hand controls similar to those found on a bicycle. As you can imagine, this raised a lot of questions about safety. What happens if the vehicle crashes? What happens if it gets attacked? And what if it runs out of fuel? Well, the good news is that none of those things could actually happen. The engine couldn't explode or melt down because it was designed to be as safe as possible. And even if it did break down, the crew could simply abandon ship and swim to safety. But despite these safety features, the project was canceled in 1973 due to budget constraints. If you want to learn more about nuclear power, check out my video on the world's first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. So, what would you use a nuclear-powered tank for? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more historical tales.